I still remember the moment the recruiter looked up from her laptop, paused for a second, and said something that made my entire body go cold. "Emily, before we go any further, is there anything you'd like to tell us about your criminal record?" For a few seconds I honestly thought she must have confused me with someone else. My name is Emily Carter. I was 27 years old at the time, and I had never even had a parking ticket in my life. I stared across the desk in that quiet office in downtown Denver, trying to process what she had just said. The office window behind her showed a bright Colorado afternoon, people walking past coffee shops and office buildings, completely normal life happening outside, while inside that room everything suddenly felt unreal. I cleared my throat and forced a small smile, assuming there had been some kind of administrative mistake. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I don't have a criminal record." The recruiter nodded slowly, but the expression on her face told me she didn't quite believe me. She turned the laptop slightly toward herself again and glanced at the screen. "That's strange," she said. "Because someone contacted our HR department earlier this week and told us we should be aware of your background." My heart began to beat faster. Earlier that week, someone contacted them. My mind raced through possibilities: identity theft, a clerical mix-up, maybe even someone with the same name as me. But none of it made sense. I had spent the past 8 months applying to jobs across Colorado after finishing my graduate program in business administration, sending out dozens of applications, attending interviews, polishing my resume, doing everything the right way. Yet somehow every promising opportunity had collapsed at the last minute. At first I blamed the job market. Then I blamed my resume. Then I blamed myself. But sitting there in that office, hearing a recruiter calmly mention a criminal record that didn't exist, something inside me shifted. Because suddenly those months of strange rejections started lining up in my mind like pieces of a puzzle. The interviews had always gone well. Managers had smiled, complimented my experience, talked about next steps. Sometimes they even said things like, "We'll be in touch very soon." And then, without explanation, the emails would arrive. "Thank you for your time. We've decided to move forward with another candidate." It had happened again and again, so many times that I had started to doubt my own abilities. But now a quiet, unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if those rejections weren't normal at all? What if something was happening behind the scenes every single time I applied for a job? I looked back at the recruiter and asked the question that would change everything. "Can you tell me who contacted you?" She hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how much she was allowed to say, then folded her hands on the desk and answered carefully. "It was a phone call," she said. "Someone who said they were a concerned family member." And in that moment, without any proof yet, without any explanation, I felt a chill run through me because a single terrifying possibility had just entered my mind, and I desperately hoped I was wrong. I left that interview in downtown Denver with a strange feeling sitting in the pit of my stomach. The recruiter had been polite and professional, but the conversation had clearly changed the moment the subject of a criminal record appeared. She told me she would need to verify some information before the hiring team could continue with the process. I nodded, thanked her for her time, and walked out of the building trying to act calm even though my mind was racing. Outside the air was cool and dry the way Colorado afternoons often are, and I remember standing on the sidewalk for a moment watching people pass by, wondering how a normal job interview had somehow turned into one of the most confusing conversations of my life. On the drive back to my apartment I kept replaying the recruiter's words in my head. Someone had called their human resources department. Someone who said they were a concerned family member. The phrase would not leave my mind. I tried to convince myself it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe someone had the wrong Emily Carter. Maybe there was another person with my name somewhere in the state and things had been mixed up. But deep down something about the situation did not feel random. When I got home I opened my laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet I had been keeping for months. After finishing graduate school I had treated the job search like a full-time job. I tracked every application, every interview, every email exchange. There were 32 companies listed in that spreadsheet across Denver, Boulder, and Colorado Springs. I had interviewed with 9 of them in person and reached the final stage with at least 5. And yet somehow every single opportunity had disappeared right when it seemed closest to becoming real. I began reading through the timeline again. February 10th, strong interview with a marketing firm in Boulder, rejected 3 days later without explanation. March 3rd, second interview with a logistics company in Denver, hiring manager said I was a top candidate, rejection email arrived the following Monday. April 20th, long interview process with a consulting firm, 3 separate meetings with executives, and then silence followed by another polite rejection. At the time I had assumed it was simply competition. Colorado had a growing job market and plenty of qualified applicants. But now that strange question about a criminal record echoed in my mind, and suddenly those rejections no longer looked like ordinary bad luck. They looked like a pattern. I leaned back in my chair and tried to remember every conversation I had during the hiring process. Most companies asked for references and background checks only after the final interview stage. That meant if someone was contacting them privately, it would likely happen right around that same moment when the hiring decision was being finalized. I felt a slow wave of unease as the pieces began fitting together. If someone had been calling these companies and saying damaging things about me, it would explain why everything collapsed at the exact same point every time. My reputation would have been destroyed before I even knew what was happening. The thought made my hands shake slightly on the keyboard. I told myself again that it could still be a misunderstanding, but another memory surfaced that made my stomach tighten even more. A few weeks earlier during a Sunday dinner, my mother had casually asked where I was applying for jobs. She sounded curious and supportive, and I had happily told her about several companies, including the marketing firm in Boulder and the consulting group in Denver. At the time it felt like a normal family conversation. But now, sitting alone in my apartment staring at that spreadsheet of failed opportunities, I felt the first real spark of suspicion forming in my mind. I did not want to believe it. I truly hoped I was wrong. But the recruiter had said the caller claimed to be a family member, and suddenly that single detail would not let go of me. I sat in my apartment long after the sun had gone down, staring at the spreadsheet on my laptop while that uncomfortable suspicion continued to grow in the back of my mind. I did not want to believe it, and honestly I felt guilty even thinking about it. My parents had always presented themselves as supportive. My mother, Linda Carter, loved telling people that her daughter had earned a graduate degree. My father, Robert Carter, often asked about my classes and future plans during family dinners. Nothing about them had ever seemed openly hostile. Yet the recruiter's words kept repeating in my mind. Someone had called their human resources department and claimed to be a concerned family member. That detail would not go away. Over the next 2 days I tried to focus on other things, but the thought kept returning. Finally, I decided that the only way to understand what was happening was to ask someone directly. I sent a polite email to the recruiter I had met with in Denver, thanking her again for the interview and asking if she could clarify one small detail. I explained that I had never had a criminal record and that the comment during the interview had confused me. I asked whether she could share any additional information about the call they received. I honestly expected that she might ignore the question because companies are usually very careful about privacy. But the following afternoon she replied. Her message was brief and professional, yet the information inside it made my stomach tighten. She explained that their human resources department had received a phone call 3 days before my interview. The caller had introduced herself as a family member who was worried about my background. According to the recruiter, the woman sounded calm and serious and insisted the company should be aware that I had been involved in legal trouble in the past. The recruiter wrote that because the call came from someone claiming to be family, the company felt obligated to pause the hiring process until they could verify information through official background checks. I read that email 3 times in silence. A woman. A family member. Those words echoed inside my head. For the first time, the possibility that had been quietly forming in my mind started to feel disturbingly real. I pushed my chair back from the desk and began pacing across my living room. My mother's voice floated into my memory, asking casual questions during Sunday dinner. She always sounded curious whenever I talked about interviews. She would ask the names of the companies, the location of the offices, even the names of the hiring managers if I mentioned them. At the time, it had felt like normal interest from a parent who wanted to see her child succeed. But now every one of those conversations suddenly looked different. The timing alone was unsettling. The recruiter said the phone call came 3 days before my interview. That meant whoever made the call knew exactly when I would be meeting with the company. Very few people had that information. My close friends did not know the exact dates. My former professors did not know either. But my parents did. I had mentioned the interview during dinner the week before because my mother had asked about my job search again. I remember clearly that she had smiled and said she hoped the interview would go well. Standing there in my apartment that night, I felt a strange mix of disbelief and fear. I still did not have proof of anything. It was entirely possible that I was imagining connections that did not exist. Yet the more I thought about the pattern of my failed job opportunities, the more one unsettling question kept surfacing in my mind. What if this was not just one strange phone call? What if someone had been making calls like that for months without me ever knowing? I barely slept that night because my mind refused to stop connecting pieces that I desperately wanted to keep separate. Every memory from the past few months started replaying in a different light, and the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable the situation felt. I tried to remain logical and remind myself that suspicion is not proof. Still, the timing of everything was becoming harder to ignore. The following morning, I opened my spreadsheet again and began carefully reviewing the timeline of every serious job opportunity one had pursued since graduating. I looked at interview dates, follow-up emails, and the exact day each rejection arrived. Something immediately stood out. In almost every case, the rejection happened shortly after I had mentioned the opportunity during a conversation with my parents. Sometimes it was a phone call with my mother where she asked how the job search was going. Other times it happened during Sunday dinner at their house in the suburbs about 20 minutes outside Denver. My parents always liked hosting family dinners. My mother would cook something warm and comforting while my father talked about neighborhood news or sports. At some point during the evening, the conversation would turn toward my job search. My mother would ask questions that sounded supportive on the surface. Which company is this one again? Where is their office located? When is your next interview? At the time, I never thought twice about sharing those details. They were my parents after all. But now the pattern felt impossible to ignore. Every time I shared information about a promising opportunity, something seemed to happen shortly afterward that caused the opportunity to disappear. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk through a nearby park to clear my head. The air smelled like pine trees and early summer grass, and families were out walking their dogs or pushing strollers along the paths. Normally, that kind of peaceful environment helped me relax, but that day my thoughts were too loud. I kept asking myself the same question again and again. If someone really had been calling these companies pretending to warn them about me, how could they possibly know exactly where to call and when to call unless I had unknowingly given them the information myself? That realization created a heavy feeling in my chest. I sat down on a wooden bench and tried to slow my breathing while I considered another possibility that made the situation even more disturbing. If this had happened once, it might still be an accident or misunderstanding. But if the same kind of call had happened multiple times across different companies, that meant someone was intentionally repeating the same story again and again. Someone was actively interfering with my future. When I returned home later that evening, my phone showed a new email notification. It was from a different company I had interviewed with 2 weeks earlier, a consulting firm located in Boulder. My heart began beating faster as I opened the message. The hiring manager thanked me again for my time and professionalism but explained that the company would not be moving forward with my application. The message was polite and standard, yet the timing felt painfully familiar. 2 nights earlier I had visited my parents for dinner and mentioned that the Boulder interview had gone extremely well. My mother had smiled and said she was proud of me. Now here was another rejection arriving shortly afterward. I closed the laptop slowly and sat in silence for several minutes. The pattern was becoming clearer with every passing day, and a part of me realized that if I wanted the truth I would have to stop guessing and start testing what was really happening behind the scenes. I spent the next 2 days thinking about the pattern that had begun to reveal itself, and by the time Wednesday evening arrived I realized that guessing was no longer enough. If someone truly was sabotaging my job opportunities, then the only way to confirm it was to create a situation where I could observe what happened next. The idea made me uncomfortable at first because it meant deliberately testing the people closest to me, but the alternative was continuing to lose opportunities without ever understanding why. So I came up with a plan that felt simple and controlled. First, I applied to a real position with a small marketing analytics firm located in Fort Collins, about 65 miles north of Denver. The company was growing quickly and the position matched my degree perfectly. I completed the application carefully and scheduled an initial phone interview for the following week. Then I did something different. I did not tell anyone in my family about it. Not my mother, not my father, not even my younger cousin who occasionally asked about my job search. I kept the information completely to myself. If my theory was correct, no mysterious phone call would happen because no one would know where to call. But the second part of my plan was even more important. That Sunday evening I drove to my parents' house for our usual family dinner just like I had done dozens of times before. Their house sat in a quiet neighborhood lined with tall maple trees, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed dramatic or suspicious. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. My father sat in the living room watching a baseball game on television. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, which somehow made the secret I was carrying feel even heavier. During dinner my mother asked the question she always asked sooner or later. How is the job search going? I took a slow sip of water and answered carefully, pretending to think for a moment. Then I told them about a new opportunity with a technology consulting firm in Colorado Springs. The company I mentioned did exist, but I had never applied there. I explained that I had an important interview scheduled later that week and that the office was located in a large business complex downtown. My mother nodded with interest and asked a few follow-up questions just like she normally did. What is the company called? What kind of work do they do? When is your interview scheduled? I answered calmly, giving just enough detail to make the story sound believable while keeping my voice steady. My father simply listened while cutting his chicken and occasionally glancing up from his plate. Nothing about their reactions seemed unusual. If anything, the conversation felt almost routine. Yet as I drove home later that night I could not stop thinking about what would happen next. If my suspicion was wrong, then nothing unusual would occur and the story would end there. But if my suspicion was right, then somewhere in the next few days that consulting firm in Colorado Springs might receive a phone call from someone claiming to be a concerned family member. The idea made my stomach tighten as I pulled into my apartment parking lot. I did not want to believe that someone in my own family could be interfering with my future, but for the first time I had created a situation where the truth might reveal itself without any guessing at all. I spent the next few days watching my phone and email more carefully than I ever had before. The plan I had created now depended entirely on what would happen next. If nothing happened, then I would finally be able to let go of the suspicion that had been slowly building inside my mind. But if something did happen, then the truth would become impossible to ignore. Monday morning arrived and I went through my normal routine, drinking coffee at my small kitchen table while checking emails and reviewing job listings. I reminded myself that the story I had told my parents about the consulting firm in Colorado Springs was completely false. I had never applied there, never scheduled an interview, and never contacted anyone from that company. The only people who believed that opportunity existed were my parents. That was the entire point of the test. Around midday, curiosity finally pushed me to do something I had not originally planned. I searched online for the main office phone number of the consulting firm I had mentioned during dinner. The number appeared within seconds along with the address of their downtown Colorado Springs building. I hesitated for a moment before dialing because part of me worried that making the call would somehow influence the situation. But another part of me knew that if a phone call had already been made about me, someone inside the company might remember it. After a few rings, a friendly voice answered and introduced herself as someone from the Human Resources Department. I explained politely that I was researching potential opportunities with the company and had a quick question about their hiring process. The woman answered patiently while I slowly worked the conversation toward the subject that mattered most to me. Finally, I asked something that made my heart begin to beat faster even before she responded. I asked whether the company had recently received any unusual phone calls regarding a job applicant named Emily Carter. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that instantly makes your stomach tighten because you know the answer is about to change everything. Then the woman spoke again in a slightly different tone. She said that a call like that had in fact come in earlier that morning. According to her description, the caller had sounded concerned and insisted that the company should be cautious if they were considering hiring someone with my name because there were serious issues in my background. I thanked her for the information as calmly as I could and ended the call a few seconds later. For several minutes I simply sat there holding my phone while a wave of disbelief moved through me. The consulting firm had received that phone call only hours earlier. That meant someone had heard the story I told at dinner and immediately contacted the company the next business day. The pattern was no longer a theory or a coincidence. It was real. Someone who had access to my personal conversations was actively calling employers and repeating the same damaging story about me. As the realization settled in, I felt a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and clarity. The test I created had worked exactly as intended. The only question that remained now was the one I had been afraid to answer from the beginning. If the information about that fake interview existed only inside my parents' house, then who had made the phone call that morning? I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that phone call with the human resources representative in Colorado Springs ended. The room was completely quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic moving along the main road outside my apartment building. My phone was still in my hand, but I was no longer looking at the screen. I was staring straight ahead while the realization slowly settled into place. The test had worked exactly the way I designed it. The consulting firm had received a warning call about me even though I had never contacted them, never submitted an application, and never scheduled an interview. The only people who believed that opportunity existed were my parents. That meant the person making those calls had to be someone who heard that conversation during Sunday dinner. I tried one last time to think of an alternative explanation. Maybe someone else had been in the house that night. Maybe a neighbor overheard something somehow. But the more I examined the possibilities, the more unrealistic they sounded. My parents lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the houses were spaced far apart and the windows were closed because of the cool spring weather. The conversation had happened inside their dining room with only 3 people present. My mother, my father, and me. A strange mix of emotions moved through me as the truth became harder to deny. Part of me felt angry because someone had clearly been interfering with my future for months. Another part of me felt deeply sad because the evidence pointed directly toward the 2 people who were supposed to support me the most. I leaned back in my chair and replayed the dinner conversation again in my mind. My mother asking curious questions about the company name. My father listening quietly while cutting his chicken. At the time, nothing about the moment had felt suspicious. Now it felt like the beginning of a trap being set without my knowledge. But even though the pattern seemed clear, I still did not have absolute proof about who had made the call. The human resources representative had only told me that the caller sounded like a concerned female family member. That detail alone suggested my mother, yet assumptions were not enough if I wanted the full truth. If I confronted them without evidence, they could simply deny everything and the entire situation would collapse into an argument with no answers. I knew I needed something stronger than suspicion. I needed proof that could not be explained away. Over the next several hours, I began thinking about how I might confirm the identity of the caller without alerting anyone that I was investigating them. Eventually, a simple idea started forming in my mind. If the person making these calls believed they were protecting employers from hiring me, then they would probably repeat the same story again if another opportunity appeared. That meant I could create one more situation similar to the previous test, but this time I would involve the company directly. Instead of simply waiting to hear whether a call had happened, I could ask the company to document the conversation if it occurred again. The thought made me nervous because it meant the situation was about to become very real. Up until this point, everything had happened quietly in the background. But if I moved forward with this plan, the next step might finally reveal the exact voice behind those damaging phone calls. And deep down, even though I already feared the answer, I knew I needed to hear it. The next morning I woke up with a strange sense of determination that I had not felt in months. For a long time I had been confused and discouraged by the endless cycle of promising interviews followed by sudden rejection emails. Now I finally understood that something deliberate had been happening behind the scenes, and for the first time I felt ready to face it directly. I opened my laptop and began organizing everything I knew so far. I wrote down the dates of each suspicious rejection, the companies involved, and the information the recruiter in Denver and the human resources representative in Colorado Springs had shared with me. Seeing the timeline laid out clearly made the pattern even more obvious. Someone had been repeating the same story about me again and again, telling employers that I had a criminal past that did not exist. After reviewing everything carefully, I decided to move forward with the idea that had formed the night before. If the person making those calls believed they were helping companies avoid hiring me, then they would probably repeat the behavior again if they thought another opportunity had appeared. This time, however, I would make sure the company knew exactly what was happening. I contacted the human resources representative in Colorado Springs again later that morning and explained the situation more openly. I told her that I had reason to believe someone might be falsely contacting companies and spreading misinformation about me. I emphasized that I had never been involved in any criminal activity and that I suspected the caller might try again if they believed I was still applying to the company. The representative listened patiently and then said something that immediately gave me a small sense of relief. She told me that if another call came in regarding my name, they could document the conversation and record the details for their internal records. She explained that companies sometimes encounter situations where outside individuals attempt to interfere with hiring decisions, and that their department takes those incidents seriously. Hearing that made me feel less alone in the situation. For months I had felt like I was fighting invisible obstacles with no explanation, but now someone else was aware of the problem and willing to help clarify what was happening. Later that evening I drove back to my parents' house for another family dinner just like I had done the previous weekend. The familiar routine almost felt surreal now that I understood what might be happening behind the scenes. My mother greeted me warmly and asked how my week had been going. My father sat at the kitchen table reading the local newspaper while waiting for dinner to finish cooking. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. During the meal my mother eventually asked the question I had been expecting. She wanted to know whether I had heard anything new about job opportunities. I took a slow breath and calmly mentioned that the consulting firm in Colorado Springs seemed very interested in my application and that they might schedule a follow-up interview soon. I spoke carefully, watching their reactions without making it obvious that I was observing them. My mother nodded thoughtfully and asked a few additional questions about the company just like she had done before. My father remained quiet, occasionally glancing up from his plate. The conversation continued normally, yet inside my mind I knew that another test had just begun. Somewhere over the next day or two the consulting firm might receive another phone call. And if they did, this time there would finally be a clear record of exactly who was trying to destroy my future. The next 2 days moved slowly, almost painfully slow, as I waited to see whether the final piece of the truth would reveal itself. Every time my phone vibrated with a notification my heart jumped slightly, wondering if it might be the message that confirmed everything I already suspected. Wednesday afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, the email finally arrived. It was from the same human resources representative at the consulting firm in Colorado Springs. I stared at the subject line for several seconds before opening it, already feeling that strange mixture of dread and relief that comes when you know an answer is about to appear. Her message was short but very clear. She wrote that earlier that morning their office had received another phone call regarding my name. As promised, the company had documented the details carefully. According to her notes, the caller again claimed to be a concerned family member warning the company about my supposed criminal history. But this time there was more information. The caller had provided her full name during the conversation. I felt my chest tighten as I continued reading the message. The name written in the email was Linda Carter. My mother. For a long moment I simply sat there at my kitchen table staring at the screen, letting the words sink in. Part of me had already known this was coming, yet seeing the truth written so clearly still felt surreal. The person who had been quietly damaging my opportunities for months was not a stranger, not a jealous coworker, not some random misunderstanding. It was my own mother. The human resources representative explained that their department had politely thanked the caller for the information but had also noted that the claims were unsupported and potentially misleading. Because they had already been informed about the situation, the company recognized the call as an attempt to interfere with a hiring process rather than a legitimate concern. I thanked her sincerely for documenting everything and closed my laptop slowly. The room felt very quiet again, but this time the confusion that had filled my mind for months was gone. In its place was a calm understanding of what had actually been happening. My parents had not simply been curious about my job search. My mother had been using the information I shared during family dinners to contact employers and tell them a false story about me. Whether she believed she was protecting me or controlling my choices no longer mattered. The result had been the same every time. Opportunities disappeared before I ever had the chance to prove myself. That evening I went for a long walk through the same park where I had sat weeks earlier trying to make sense of everything. The air was cool and the sky was turning orange as the sun lowered behind the trees. For the first time in months my thoughts felt clear. I could not change what had already happened, but now I understood it. And understanding the truth meant I could finally decide what came next for my life without confusion, without doubt, and without the quiet interference that had followed me for so long.